I've now owned the Nikon D850 for a year, so I thought what better time to actually reflect on this and give you my review of this camera body. An entire year gives me a decent platform of real-world experience in which to base my review. The initial euphoria of the camera purchase has long since worn off, so I'd like to think this is going to be a fairly true and accurate review of this camera body. Now, I bought this camera as a long-term investment, something that would last me years. I was getting tired of taking micro steps with my body upgrades, so I decided to go big or go home and invest in this. And my kind of rationale for that was that this is going to give me real longevity, and hopefully I'll get easily a good 5 or 6 years out of this camera. In its first year with me, this camera has been my travel and landscape photography workhorse. I've used it in locations such as Sri Lanka and Tanzania. I've used it for diverse photography, from astrophotography right through to wildlife photography. I've used it in challenging conditions, from scorching desert to sub-zero snow and ice. I tend to use my cameras in quite an active way, so this camera has really had to earn my respect over the last year. In this review, I'm going to go over all the positives and negatives of this camera body that I've encountered in my first year of use for travel and landscape scenarios. It's not going to be a comprehensive list about everything that's good and bad about this camera. It's not going to be possible for me to do that, but it's going to be the main things that have really stood out for me. If you've been sitting on the fence about getting this camera, or you're just generally intrigued by it, hopefully this review will be useful for you. Let's start with the positives, and let's be clear, there's way more positives than there are negatives for this camera body. Now, the first thing that really stood out for me is the dynamic range. It's absolutely exceptional. It's the best dynamic range I've ever seen on a camera that I have used personally. When you shoot at ISO 64, the details that you can recover in the shadows and in the highlights is truly incredible. It's got to the point where I don't really need to use bracketing anymore. It's quite rare that I ever need to use it, because I can recover all the details I need to in a single image. Megapixels. This has got a 45.7 megapixel sensor in it, and that is probably way more than I need, but I'm not complaining because the images this delivers are just exceptional. The amount of detail captured, it never fails to blow me away, and it's so useful for cropping and for correcting distortions in your images without sacrificing too much resolution. And it looks absolutely beautiful in prints as well. The only slight downside is it's very unforgiving, so if there's any deficiencies in your shooting technique, the resolution of this sensor will show up very easily. That leads me nicely into the next strength of this camera, cropping. Now, the DX crop on this is exceptional. It delivers images at 19.4 megapixels. The sheer resolution of this sensor means that those crops are way more appealing. It also offers various other cropping modes like 1:1, 5:4 ratios, and it's just so beautiful to use with the masking that's applied in the viewfinder. High ISO performance is extraordinary on this camera, considering the high resolution of its sensor. I do a lot of astrophotography, and this is easily the best camera that I've ever used in nighttime situations. I can bump the ISO up to 5000 or 6400 quite comfortably on this. The viewfinder. Now, this may seem like quite a small deal, but it really isn't. This is one of the best viewfinders I've ever used. It's got 0.75 magnification and 100% field of view, which makes it an absolute joy to use. I'm quite old school. I tend to use the viewfinder more than live view, so for me, this is actually quite a big deal. And also, it's got a really handy eyepiece cover, which is great for long exposure photography. The touchscreen on this camera is fantastic. First of all, it's really large and it's really bright, which makes it really easy to use on bright sunny days where it's sometimes difficult to actually see what's going on the screen. The touch functionality is stunningly useful. I mean, I can't believe that I ever lived without it now. It just makes going through the menu so easy, and reviewing images with just a double tap is just an absolute pleasure to use. Also, the fact that the screen tilts is really useful if you're shooting at low angles or high angles. It just makes those awkward positions that little bit easier. It would be nice if it was fully articulating like my vlog camera, the Canon 200D, which I'm filming with now, but I guess you can't have everything. The weather sealing on this seems to be brilliant. I've put this camera through a lot of tricky conditions over the last year: rain, snow, sand, and it's withstood it all. The build quality generally feels really exceptional, with some tiny exception to that, which I'll get onto a little bit later. Backlit buttons. How on earth did I ever live without this feature previously? I don't know. It's an absolute revelation for astrophotography. We've got a bit of sun. The 153-point autofocus system on this is stunningly good. It's very accurate, it's very versatile, and it's exceptionally quick. Plus, it works really, really well in low light situations. I've actually been blown away by some of the astrophotography situations that I've put the autofocus system through in this. And yeah, it can really find focus in situations that you wouldn't expect it to. Battery life. Now, I've read a lot of things suggesting people have had negative experiences with the battery life in this, but that hasn't been my experience at all. I've been really impressed with it compared to previous Nikon cameras I've had. The old style batteries don't work too well, but Nikon released a new style of battery around the time that they released this camera, and using those, it delivers really good longevity. It hasn't really let me down in the year that I've used it, so I'm very impressed by how many shots I can get out of this. The focus stacking feature on this camera is really cool. Now, it's not always useful for simple focus stacking situations where you've just got 2 or 3 images. It's probably more hassle than it's worth, and you may as well just do it manually. But for anything a little bit more intensive, like macro situations or astrophotography where you've got shallow depth of field, it's been an absolute revelation. The time-lapse features of this camera are amazing. It actually has a 4K time-lapse mode which creates the time-lapses within camera, which makes it super easy to create absolutely beautiful sequences. And if that isn't enough, you can of course create 8K time-lapses manually with this. Focus peaking is another really useful feature that they've added into this camera. It's great for manual video work and for double checking focus. There are a lot of restrictions on where it can and can't be used, however. The joystick on the back of this camera is really useful, particularly for moving around your autofocus point when using the viewfinder. I can't imagine going back and using a camera model that doesn't have this joystick. Finally, the silent interval timer mode on this is really useful when shooting long time-lapse sequences or star trails that may involve many hundreds or even thousands of images. That's useful because it's going to avoid actual mechanical shutter actions, which is going to increase the longevity of that all-important component of the camera body. On to the negatives, and there really aren't that many of them. The first is the video is a bit clunky to use on this. The actual video features themselves are really strong, and I think in the hands of a professional filmmaker they could create really quality work using this camera body. But I'm not a professional in that regard, so I didn't find it particularly enjoyable or user-friendly to use, to be honest. The autofocus in particular is very, very poor. For a camera of this quality and standard, I'm shocked that the autofocus is as bad as it is. The actual dual pixel system on the Canon system, which is filming me right now on the 200D, is utterly superior to what's in this. The camera writes to dual cards. One is the traditional SD card, the other is the XQD card, and this is quite a pioneering format. Now, I totally understand why they've used this. The image sizes on this camera are absolutely huge, so they really needed the fastest technology in order to deal with that. But I just don't think the format was very well supported, certainly not at the time of launch, because I found it very difficult to get my hands on these cards and they were stupidly expensive. Now that may well have changed since, but it was an annoyance for me nonetheless. The autofocus in the live view mode on this absolutely sucks in my opinion. It's not good enough for a camera of this standard. I don't tend to use live view that much. I'm quite old-fashioned. I tend to use the viewfinder, but nonetheless, I expect a lot better. The build quality on this camera is generally exceptional, but there are a few concerns. Earlier this year, I actually dropped this camera and broke the eyepiece around here, and you can find out exactly how I did that at the top now. Needless to say, I sent it off to Nikon and they fully repaired it and everything was fine. But since getting it back, I've actually noticed that in this eyepiece unit round here, where the screws bolt it into the camera, little hairline sort of cracks have started to appear around those screws, and this hasn't suffered any more impacts or any damage. I've taken very good care of it. This just seems to be natural wear and tear. I feel that's quite poor after just a year of ownership. This camera doesn't have any in-body stabilization, and I think that's quite poor on their flagship camera. You see a lot of the other camera manufacturers nowadays putting this in as standard to their cameras, and I think it's really important. Nikon seem to have prioritized the VR in their lenses, and that's all well and good, but if you don't happen to own VR lenses, and I've got a few lenses that don't have VR in, then that's a bit of a problem. I just feel that in a camera of this standard, really, in this day and age, some form of in-body stabilization should be put into this. Now, they do have an electronic VR mode in this for video, but it's not quite the same. And finally, this camera is an absolute unit. It's bloody heavy. Now, that's totally understandable because it's actually quite remarkable that they've actually managed to pack the technology that they have done into such a small unit, but still, it's very heavy, particularly if you're quite an active photographer like I am, where I go hiking long distances into the mountains and I'm carrying lots of other equipment, particularly vlogging equipment at the same time. It's absolutely back-breaking, so every gram really counts, and this is a heavy camera. I just wish they could just get it that little bit lighter. And that concludes my roundup of the positives and negatives of this camera. As you can see, there's way more positives than there are negatives, and overall I do not regret buying this camera for 1 nanosecond. It's been one of the best purchases I have ever made. It's an exceptional camera body, and I'm really looking forward to using it in the years ahead. So in summary, the D850 is amazing, but I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Do you own the D850? Do you have experience in using it? What do you feel are the positives and negatives of this camera? Do you regret buying it, or are you on the sidelines thinking of purchasing it? Overall, I'd just be really interested to hear your thoughts on this particular camera body and your experiences with it. As always, if you've enjoyed watching this video, any likes, comments or subscribes are very much appreciated, and I'll see you all soon, where hopefully I'll get out taking some pictures with this awesome bit of kit. See you all soon.